Good afternoon, everybody. I'm conscious of that it is just after 4 o'clock. So, yeah, thank you for joining me for an exciting hour looking at the GCSE stats papers from the summer. So hopefully, I've used a similar format to what we've done for the last few years, where we're going to have a very quick look at the entry data, but then more particularly looking at what we can do in terms of what questions were answered well and the areas for improvement. Because like you guys, I'm a teacher and I would be sat there thinking, okay, what do I need to do to get back for my students to get better at this? Have a look at some of the keynotes from the examiners, because they're always really worth looking at. Grade boundaries, and then look at some of the support that you can get from Pearson. I'm going to try not to make any draw conclusions when we look at some of the data from the questions. I will, on the first paper we go through, I'm just going to explain the rationale for the questions I've chose for us to look at. So in terms of the entries this summer, it was another bumper summer, another 5,000 students doing the qual, which is brilliant, with Pearson having 82% of the entries, up from 81 the previous year. So it is a growing qualification. That shows you Pearson's entries. And interestingly, when we look at the Pearson's profile compared to the national profile, you can see that the 7+ Pearson was about 19.9%, whereas the national picture was about 20%, so it's there or thereabouts. Similarly with the grade 4s that were awarded and the grade 1s. So the Pearson profile very much fits the national picture that's going on out there. And then in terms of tiers of entry, we can see that there's more students entered for foundation. I will let you draw your own conclusions to that. But given that we've got growing numbers of entries, I suspect it is that more whole cohorts are doing it. Because when you look at, because I had a little bit of a delve, same as I did last year, the age 15, so the year 10 numbers aren't increasing massively. They've gone down slightly by 20 students. And similarly, the older candidates, so your resits and your external adults, is holding fast. So the growth is coming from year 11 candidates, which may account for that shift in the higher foundation, more in line with what we see on the maths GCSE anyway. So I just thought that was quite interesting. So we're going to have a look at all 4 papers. What I've done, and this data, I will make this available for the Pearson team to put on the Emporium as an additional file. So I've done the skills maps. What I've gone through is I've actually eyeballed the topics on the skills maps and made them a bit more user-friendly, because same pictograms, well, is it completing pictogram? Is it using? Is it comparing? Is it interpreting? So I've just gone through and added a little bit to each of those and made it a little less vague. From that, I then looked at the best 2 performing questions, the worst 2 performing questions, but also this rationale I've used a few times now is that I've allocated every question a position in the paper, so 1 to 45, and then looked at the performance in terms of the mean percentage of that question. So you can see question 1A was position 1 in the paper, but it was the best answered question with 93%. Question 2 or 1B was position 2, but it was the 3rd best performing question. And then I've looked at any that look out of kilter, i.e. that they're in this certain position. So I've looked at the extremes so we can have a look, because that's what we're trying to look at in terms of shifting the cohort upwards. And you'll see something interesting as we go through these. So down the bottom there, you'll see that the mean score, or the mean percentage that each grade got on each question. So you can see there that 45 was the mean score for a grade 4 student, 35. So somewhere between, so were you to use these for grading, you might go, okay, so somewhere between the grade 3 average and the grade 4 average would be because if it's the average grade 4, the grade boundary for a grade 4 would be somewhere between 3 and 4. So that's why those skills maps are really useful. So we're going to look at the top 2 performing questions, the worst 2 performing questions, and then the extremes in terms of their position in the paper. What is key is, and again, I've done this every year, and as you're preparing students for the GCSE, the actual papers next summer, what they should know, and I've always found this useful to show students, is that unlike GCSE maths, where the ramping in terms of difficulty, we'd expect it to have higher percentage at the beginning and then lower percentages at the end as the paper got more difficult. These percentages go up and down because each question, within each question, there might be 5 or 6 parts in a question. That within each, so I don't know, scattergraph question, it might only be part F that is at 15% in terms of the mean percentage that was scored, but everything else will be quite high. Just so that they get used to, it's not when you get to a really tough question or tough part question that you stop trying, because the next topic could be pictograms, the next topic could be, so within a topic that difficulty varies. So in terms of foundation paper 1, they generally performed really well on the first 5 questions, and there was varying degrees of success on some of the others, as we would expect. It was generally well received by students. And when we look through the paper, as we're going to do now, the 3 stars shows that it was the best performing question. That's just for me, so I haven't got to go looking at my notes all the time. I'm very visual. So, and most students were able to do it. As you'd expect, it is on GCSE maths. It's something that they've been doing for years, so we shouldn't expect any surprises. But then you get to this. This isn't the worst performing, but it is one that was surprisingly, it popped up as being in the wrong position for how bad, given that it was 2A or 2AI. The vertical axis, it was surprisingly not answered well. So it proved they could get the country on the bottom, but it proved really challenging for students in that lots of students, I shouldn't say the vast majority, lots of students omitted to use the word percentage or even the symbol percentage as part of their answer. So that let them down, which is a little bit of a surprise. Then we've got continuing, this continues to be an issue. As you will see, there's a common theme about appropriateness, and it was a theme that I picked up last autumn when I did the summer 23 papers. This being able to justify, and is it appropriate to use a bar chart? Is it appropriate to use a stem and leaf diagram? Continues to be a major issue across the board. And is it because we're not within our teaching talking about what else could I use for this, or why would I not? Then 3AI was the second best paper question on the paper. All they were doing really was extracting information from a table, as you do. And we would imagine students should be pretty au fait with that, but it is the foundation paper. Then, disappointingly, the use, being able to categorize and use definitions, many candidates failed to choose the correct word, discrete, and they often chose continuous. Perhaps maybe that they were thinking, well, it's numerical and numerical data is continuous. I don't know, there could be any number of reasons why, but is it because we're not doing enough recall of definitions? Then again, similar theme, paper 1, question 4C. The advantage of using the median was rarely stated, but they quite often did state it was quick and easy to calculate. So again, it's that thing about why are we using these certain diagrams? Why are we using these certain averages? That's quite a common theme that comes through as well about advantages and disadvantages of using certain averages. Question 1, 4B, again, similar theme about they struggle to understand systematic sampling in part B. It was clear they knew different types of sampling, and there was a very even split between those that went for random or stratified. Is it just unlucky that it was systematic this year and maybe students are not that au fait with it? Who knows? But that came through loud and clear. Many students were able to answer this, so this was answered really well. By stating the manager might want to take feedback from non-members, or that making changes may decide, so that was really well answered. So the 1 star there in the corner is that it was a well answered question in terms of its location within the paper. Some of these should be no surprise to us. Again, well answered paper. These were interpreted really well by candidates. They were able to pick out that Harrogate had proportionally more houses, or South Shields had proportionally more bungalows. And where students offered a generalisation that there were proportionally more houses than any other property in Harrogate, it was recognised as a valid comparison. So if there is ever a doubt about, oh, is that acceptable? Sometimes go and have a look at the examiner's reports, because there is a lot to garner from these reports that may not be included in the mark schemes. So it was condoned when candidates referenced to the number of properties or the angles rather than the proportion, as this was tested later in the question. So it's just nice to see sometimes that there is that little bit of where we're able to condone certain things. Again, and I think that by now I think you're picking up, there's a common theme about appropriateness. If this was the 2nd worst on the paper, it was really rare to see a correct response that offered a reason why or why not a frequency polygon was suitable. More frequently seen was a suggestion of using an alternative rather than whether or not it was appropriate. And you'll notice there on the solutions I put, yes, it is appropriate with continuous data, or no, because the intervals are not. So there is, as long as they're able to support that argument, and that came through in the examiner's report again about looking to the number of marks for some guidance about how much they need to be writing, and more importantly, that a yes, no answer is not appropriate. So yeah, that's a really common theme about whether is it something that we can do in our teaching. Do we just need to think about asking that question every time we're doing a new chart or diagram? Surprisingly though, the missing frequency was done really, really well. And I do think that the frequency up the side helps. If it had been at frequency density with a different scale, maybe it wouldn't have been so easily well done. But given that it is histograms is a higher only topic at GCSE, it is clear that foundation students are being taught the content. But then you get to the positive skew, or any type of skew that was the worst answered question on the paper. Again, this came out last summer, that there wasn't a great deal of understanding in terms of the difference between positive and negative skew. The very few were able to identify it, and even less able to interpret if they had identified it. So just something to think about there. How can we go about given it's 2 mark, even if it wasn't just, maybe we need to think that this is a 2-stage thing. First of all, let's get them identifying the skew, and then we'll work on getting them to interpret what that means. And then, as you would expect, tree diagrams, probability tree diagrams was one of the best, considering it was towards the end of the paper, which really supports this. That diagram I've shown you with the mean percentage per question throughout the paper, that we've got to instill in students that the GCSE stats is different to maths GCSE. This up and down in terms of, oh, that's really easy, oh, that's a bit tougher, is within a question, not within an overall paper. So the probability tree, we would expect it to be generally answered well. It was. They were generally answered with the some of them had the misconception of using 0.35 as Kirill wins on both those 2 branches on the squash as well. But in general, even this far into the paper, there were very few blank responses, which is as you would want it to be for foundation students, in terms of the experience. We want them to have a nice experience and to be able to access every part, not necessarily every part of every question, but even your lowest attaining students, you would want to be able to access some parts of every question. So yeah, interesting paper 1. We're going to do similar. I'm not going to do so much explanation about why I've chosen certain questions, but similarly, you can see the one thing I am going to add is the pale blue on the left-hand side. Yeah, left-hand side is a common assessed item. So in similar to the maths GCSE, these common assessed items are in the same order that they are, and you can find, if you were looking for just the crossover material, that is available on the Emporium. Same kind of thing, so you can look and go, okay, so the average grade 4 student on this paper got 21.6, the average grade 7 got 49.7. And then if you were giving them one paper only, you can come up with your own grade boundaries per paper if you didn't want to use the published ones. And a similar thing, we're going to look at the 2 best. Interestingly, the question 1A wasn't the best performing. The 2 worst performing questions, these that seem to perform worse compared to their position relative in the paper, and these that performed better. So there almost is our winners and losers, but I didn't want to use losers. We're going to use areas for improvement. Again, I've left those in there because if you wanted to crop those out of the presentation, you can use them to show students about, look, we've got to keep going. There's stuff in every question within the parts of a question, and some questions got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, 6, 7, 8 parts. And that they keep on going. Yes, within the question, you're going to get that, oh, that's hard. And so in general, what we found with the higher tier students, they were confident at completing the calculations and the diagrams, had really good statistical understanding when asked to interpret, but questions that we required interpretation in context and evaluation of approaches or techniques was found to be slightly more challenging. So it is across the board on both tiers. And once again, there's some advice about showing full working, but I'm going to go through at the end of this some of the key points that came out of the examiner's reports in terms of exam technique, but also topics that we can make sure we focus in on a bit more. So then the second highest performing question. So this was the second best on the paper. Parts A, I, and AII were answered really well. They were able to conclusion. Those who got parts A1 wrong often followed through with the correct interpretation, so it was answered really well. So that's good. There was a nice, easy start. However, when you look at 1B, the vast majority of students only got 1 mark here, because for correctly concluding that Bob was correct, together with a partial reason. Most were able to identify the unemployment rate was lower from reviewing the table, matched with giving the correct decision. However, less students were able to identify that the total workforce numbers had also decreased or had in fact changed. And even though the question referenced not using calculations, quite a few students did calculate the number of unemployed, which is quite interesting in terms of I'm trying to instill my students this year about look for the command words, the stuff we need to do and what we don't need to do, more importantly. And then you got to 2C. That's a common assessment item. You'll see the same thing stands. It was less well answered than the previous parts, and we've already seen that from the foundation paper. What is interesting that given this was a higher tier, very, very few candidates at both tiers identified that it might be not appropriate to use it because of the large frequency intervals. And again, it might be something that when you're doing frequency polygons, you go, would you really imagine this had two intervals on this? Would we really draw a frequency polygon? Is it telling us anything? So yeah, same theme as that's what you'd expect. I'd be a little bit worried if we had totally different stories from foundation and higher. Right, similarly, this one was the best on the paper. But where errors were seen, it was because they used the incorrect inequality symbols. Is that lack of care of intention, or is it just that they didn't understand it? Or sometimes, I know I'm guilty of this, that when it comes to writing in the description within the interval, I might write that, oh, I can't write all this out, I'm just going to write 20 to 25. And do I need to slow down and make sure that I am using the correct inequality notation? Maybe that's just me, but I don't know. It certainly got me thinking, and that's why I enjoy doing these, because you always reflect on your own teaching. Then we get to 5AI. Again, they were asked to name the sampling technique. It was poorly answered by most students. The most common answer was to incorrectly identify quota sampling or judgment sampling. And aside from that, candidates gave a full range of other sampling techniques. Some were able to identify it as either cluster sampling or, more commonly, convenience sampling or opportunity sampling. So again, it's this, what definitions and processes are we instilling in them, and what's sticking? Then we get the worst question on the paper. They were asked to interpret their answer. To be fair, it was almost universally attempted. So kudos to students, because a few years ago there would have been some students that wouldn't have attempted it. So that's getting better. And where they had a fully correct answer, they obviously were able to interpret it correctly. Many incorrectly commented the answer was the average number of visitors to Canada, or this was the number of visitors to Canada. So yeah, again, interpretation in context is coming through loud and clear in terms of the trends. Then we've got looking at why a question is not, why a statement's not a hypothesis. It was well answered, with the majority indicating that a hypothesis should not be written as a question. And again, given that the data that part of the data cycle isn't done at GCSE. It is obvious that they are being taught the content. So that's good. Question 1, the next question, talking about action and warning lines. Again, answered well, just plotting 2 points. But you'd imagine that should be answered well. But then given the scale and it was decimals, it was answered well. And I know that some GCSE maths students would struggle to plot those at the right height. But there was lots of students, again, the common error there was to plot 29.05 as 219.05 as 219.5. And it was common enough for it to be commented on within the examiner's reports. Question 9, a different probability tree. First part required them to complete it. The majority had a go at it. Most were able to make some progress. However, the students found more difficulty in calculating. So I think part B, they found more difficulty in answering the second part of this question, where they had to calculate. So the most common misconception was to use 0.6. And a very small minority of students have failed to recognise that no calculations were required to place the probability of being late on Tuesday. Yeah, actually, you were given that, I think. Maybe not. And use the same method. So yeah, that I do think that whole conditional probability is a little bit tougher. But you'll see a common theme with this that I pick up on one of the other papers in a bit, I think. And then we get to foundation paper 2. So foundation paper 2, similar thing. We're talking about the mean mark on this being for grade 4 student 34.83, 47 for a grade 5, 24, etc., with the mean score being 27 for all students. I find that really useful to know about. Okay, so if you're a grade 4 student, I just find it useful in terms of placing my students. Again, you'll see the common assessed items were 10, 11 and 12. The last question it would be unusual for that to be on the higher as well. So again, same messages for GCSE maths, keep going, because there's a question at the end that isn't on the higher tier for those students that go, oh, I've got the higher tier content, I'm stopping working. They keep on working. And look at the best 2, the worst 2, and again, some of the others that stick out. Again, useful for students just to show, whilst there is the questions are placed in terms of, they do get progressively more difficult within a question. So you can see that question part that was at position 35. But unless they keep going, they're never going to get to that. It's about that resilience. And the feedback from this has been that they responded well to the challenges within the paper, demonstrating an understanding across a wide range of topics. It's pleasing to see this perform well on questions required standard techniques such as tally charts. They were generally confident at completing the calculations and diagrams, and demonstrated good statistical understanding when asked to interpret these. But like previous exam sittings, they were less familiar with certain topics, e.g. stratified sampling, relative risk and cumulative frequency curves. And it is important, again, and this will be the only time I mention it, maybe at the end as well, about reiterating the importance of legible handwriting. And the use of the phrase more accurate is too often seen, and I'm quoting, and not usually awarded any marks. It seemed that students were able to answer the whole paper in the entire time. Although some students made no attempt on some questions and some responses were left blank. So that's in terms of the overall performance of that paper. And I do, when you look at it, you go, okay, so that might be, I don't know, 35 to 40 might be a question, and you can see within a question there's that difficulty. Right, so question 2, parts A, B, and C. This is a tale of two stories. Part A was answered quite poorly in comparison to its position in the paper. Part B was the best part, answered question on the paper, and part C was the second best. So again, it's that when we look at part A, many students selected likely rather than it being evens. And I think I've had a conversation with students about this, and I'd be really interested if any of you, they went, well, you've got more A's than you have anything else, so you're more likely. And they were thinking about it being in terms of their language they use, rather than being able to place it on a probability line. Because when you look and you go, okay, so they understand the fact that B and D is equally likely. And for some students, they're getting confused with the fact that evens means that likely doesn't necessarily mean that there's more. Yeah, I'm confusing myself now. But that was the kind of question that I used. They went, well, there's more A's than there is anything else, so I'm more likely. Excuse me. That's gone. So then, again, ask your question to students about it. It'd be interesting one to put that part A up in front of students and see what they do. And then parts B and C, you can see we answered really well, second and third, first and second best answered on the question. Then we got to question 2, part D and E. Right, C, D and E were marked together. So there will be questions about, okay, because of the fact that some are follow through marks. So in C, they were asked to state the mode or modes. And it scored well in terms of accuracy. But a common mistake was seen, included the number 2 being written instead of the correct answer 1 and 3. Part D, the students were asked to work out the median. For this part, no follow-through was awarded from their table as students had access to the raw data. And given the context, yeah, so because they were given, they had access to the raw data. So it didn't perform as well as the team expected it to. Is that because once it's in a table, we've stopped referring and using the data that's given as a list? I don't know. So the mistake they most commonly made was using their frequencies to find the middle number. Part E, they were asked which average would be best to use for summary. And given the context, they were expected to state the median would be best because there were 2 modes. And follow through was awarded on this question depending on how many modes the student had stated in part C. There was lots of flexibility on the award of marks in this part of the question, enabling many students to still gain marks even if an error had been made in stating the modes or in their calculation of the median. I took a lot of comfort from that when I read it, because it is, as a teacher, I want students to be awarded for what they know, not necessarily for what they don't know. So that's just quite interesting. And then we've got another part. When we look at these big questions, this was a 6-mark question. So it was an extended response question, and they were expected to critique a plan. And they were prompted to critique on 3 areas. The mark scheme allowed such a variety of marks to be credited. And it was designed with foundation students in mind and thought to be very accessible. And it was a shame to see candidates not scoring more on this question. It's important to note that the candidates must conclude on their comments as to whether or not it is appropriate or not appropriate, but made no comment on this. So you will see the last line on each of those, which would make it appropriate. So it is appropriate. It is not appropriate. Again, that's about, excuse me, training students for what is acceptable and isn't acceptable. And do we need to go to our colleagues in the English department and humanities and talk about sentence starters? And how are they used? Or how do they structure a sentence? Is there something we can garner from that? 27A. Lots of candidates wrote the visitors. But on previous feedback and on previous mark schemes, it had to be all the visitors, not just the visitors. So there was an emphasis on it being everyone that visits the theme park that was required. And similarly, if the students had been asked what the sampling units were, then the visitors would have been appropriate. But in this question, it was all the visitors. Again, it's a minor point, but something we need to be explicit about in our teaching. And then we get to 8E, which is the worst performing question on the paper. Part E proved to be really tricky for students. They were required to give to decide whether or not stem and leaf was suitable or not. Again, it's that appropriateness, just reasoning and not reasoning, it's justifying about appropriateness of questions. Excuse me. Right, question 10, they've got to that, they've got a chloropleth map, which is something new for students that they've probably not seen before. Obviously they haven't, they're being taught stats, but it's a stats only topic, so it's quite nice to see students doing well on stats only topics. Part A, B and C, all answered well relative to the position in the paper. So again, it's obvious they are being taught these topics and they're not just rocking up to the exam. And then we get to 11D. So this was the second worst on the paper. Part D was about stratified sampling. And in this series, it was worth 3 marks, but in previous series, it has been part of an extended response question. And as been seen in previous series, stratified sampling is really understood by foundation students. And lots of students didn't attempt it. That's not to say that it's beyond them, is it? Because again, lack of practice. And those who gained B1 or B2 for that question were able to state the calculation and the accurate sample size for one of the groups. And very few managed to gain all 3 marks. for describing what the process was for selecting them. So I just think that's quite interesting. Again, we seem to be really good at the calculations and the diagrams, but sometimes when it comes to those explanation questions, we're not so au fait with. Right, higher paper 2. I didn't think I'd get through this, but we're whizzing. Higher paper 2, same thing. Again, I've changed the words. You can see the crossover questions. And you can see that average grade 4 student got 16.92 marks. Going up to the grade 9 students, we're going to go through the best, the worst. And most students responded really well to the challenge within this paper. And it was pleasing to see students perform well on questions requiring standard techniques such as cumulative frequency diagrams, but also things like Spearman's rank and Pearson's capture-recapture. They were generally confident at completing the calculations and demonstrating good statistical understanding. But again, they found that interpretation in context difficult. And again, evaluating the techniques was slightly more challenging. But it is pleasing to report this, again, direct quote, questions requesting candidates to explain, assess or interpret have improved compared to previous years. And again, the legibility of the scripts. And it seemed that students could answer it, so it within the time given. So let's go and have a look at some of the winners and some things we can improve. Again, you look at that profile within the paper, show it to your students and say, look, you can't be missing out on that very last part question by not giving up once you've got to, I don't know, part 28, which is probably about question 10E. So you keep going to the end because there's something there for everybody, which is why I like those. So again, chloropleth map, answered really well, best on the paper. Second best, and this is interesting that the second best was there, but also then one of the questions, again, it's the same about the stratified sampling. Candidates were less successful in explaining how they would randomly choose the students from the stratum. And those that didn't understand what a stratified sample was would describe a random sample or suggesting taking 4 from each stratum. So again, to what depth are we going through with some of these stats only topics? Just something to think about. Right, then we've got something common assessed items. So this, but for the higher tier, this risk, and part B required students to interpret the relative risk that they found in part A, and it was not answered well by many candidates. For those candidates that got the correct answer, they then misinterpreted the answer and said it was a 75% chance of failing the skills test having taken test A. Many also then stated that test B was more difficult and showed no understanding of what relative risk was. Again, it's that interpretation, and I think it's something that isn't going to get fixed overnight, but if we can just highlight it through these events. Then we got question 9C. It was the second, part C that I've identified there was the second worst on the paper. Many students, so we're talking about regression equations, many students struggle to understand the gradient given in the equation really related to the rate of increase. And so they were unable to talk about the relationships between the bone length and height for the different bones. So many students just listed which bones had the highest, lowest gradients and intercepts, or would state that the males were taller than females. So again, it's that depth of understanding. And some of you might be sitting there going, well, if they get 1 out of 3, I'm chuffed to bits. Then ask some questions on the new EMC qualification support that's available on the Emporium, that has some regression equation stuff on it. So I think there's like a little pack, and Amy might be able to pop it in, but I do know that one of the support packs, there was a load of regression equation stuff that we put together for, I think it was the EMC. But they're really tricky questions. So especially if you're looking for something for your top end, to the point where you're having to draw them. I thought it was a lovely little exercise to do. I'm not saying we'd give it to a grade 4 student, but you might want to use it as some extension work for your grade 8 or 9. So look to other places for resources. Then we've got 10AB, which is capture recapture. You would hope that given students, this is on the main GCSE, answered well. The validity and reliability on something like this was relatively well, given the position in the paper. But is that because we're so used to, by rote, giving them the answers that they would give for stating your assumptions, and they've just brought out those old assumptions that they get asked at the GCSE? I don't know. Right, I said I was going to come back to this at some point. So question 11A and 11C. So 11A was answered really well relative to the paper. However, 11C was the worst on the paper. So not just worse for relative position, but worse overall. And so candidates were asked to conclude if A and B are independent, and this was the least successful part of the question. The majority of candidates instead gave a description of mutually exclusive events instead of independent, stating no, because you can have a science fiction book that is also an audio book, or no, because the circles overlap. And those scoring in part C would generally be divided between using the 2 methods on the mark scheme. So it's interesting that it's not one method on the mark scheme. If you go and have a look at what method was, 2 methods that were detailed. So I thought that was quite interesting. But I also think it is quite a tough one in terms of knowing. I've used the correct notation there, but actually, I think words were allowed rather than just using formal notation. But I'd have to check the mark scheme off the top of my head. I don't know. So I think that's useful. For the last sort of 7-8 minutes, and I know that Amy's in the background, I just want to have a look at some of the keynotes. And I'm not going to read through it. You can read through this, but when you go through and you read the theme that comes through from the examiner's report, and I have a belief, I think we should all be given time on our inset day to read the examiner's report. It is things like reading the question, check you understand the requirements, show working out, check graphs. The one for me is check the wording of the question too. Often the values are not required and we're simply looking for comparisons. Usually if a question requires figures as part of your answer, the question will demand it. An item requiring 2 marks requires 2 parts of your answer, i.e. a comparison and a decision, or a comment and a decision, conclusion and decision, or a correlation with an interpretation. And then, so that's some feeling in terms of the exam techniques. But also from the 3 examiners' reports, I pulled together some topic areas, because I'd be like, yeah, I do all that in my teaching. Carry on, move on, Mel. Tell me what I need to be better at. Interpretation, appropriateness. Is it appropriate to use a mean? What is it appropriate to use a median? Extended response questions. Again, it's all about context. Some of you will be thinking, I need to get better at that. For me, in my context, I might be just thinking, okay, let's just think about content rather than interpretation. The key terms, the definitions, making sure we've got them on recall. Are we testing recall often enough? We've just introduced at our school, my new school, it's no longer new, but for our assessments, we've just included 10 quick questions at the beginning that are purely recall. Because what we found is that students, the same students every time, were getting low scores, and it's because they're low attaining anyway. Not to say that can't be fixed, it can, but it was affecting their confidence, getting the low scores all the time. And because for our in-class assessments we have open book, we want them to have this little sense of confidence, and we withdraw that open book as they go up through the school. But then in terms of, so I just thought it's nice one to have 10 recall topics, 10 questions, 10 marks about that we're testing. Have they got the recall of what they need to do, what we want them to do. In terms of topics for foundation, calculated interpreting relative risk, stratified sampling, and cumulative frequency curves. So they would be the three main topics in terms of topics that I would be making sure my foundation kids had more practice at this year. Higher, there's loads of stuff that you can do in terms of your teaching, and instilling them. What did make me laugh is the word whereas is not a comparison. So recognizing, again, that recall about recognizing and naming different types of sampling techniques, but also be able to describe it. And then again, same kind of thing for me, I'd be sat there going, okay, you've got all this nice stuff that talks about exam technique and stuff that I can do in my teaching, but then when it comes down to what do I need to get more practice of, same kind of thing, binomial distribution to calculate probabilities, relative risk, interpreting relative risk, geometric mean in a range of contexts, control charts, regression equations. So I definitely make sure the students have more practice at that. But if you are interested in terms of the stuff that you can do with your teaching, or in terms of preparing them for the exam rather than what topics do I need to teach, there's two different, I've split it in two different things. Right, then I'm going to finish in terms of grade boundaries. 24 to 23, they did go up slightly at the grade 5 on foundation, and the higher grade 9. So they have gone up slightly across the board, but nothing that shows that the difficulty was random. It was totally, wildly was the word I'm thinking of there, wildly different to the previous year. And then in terms of percentages, if you are a proper data geek, the cumulative percentages of grade by each tier, 24s at the top, 23s down the bottom, and you can see that there was an extra 5,000 students, and it did drop slightly, but we're talking marginally, but that's what we would expect when we have an extra 5,000 students. And then in terms of support, it continues to be the Emporium. If you haven't got access, please do. I had a conversation with Amy earlier saying I'm surprised how many teachers don't have access. You've got your crossover. There's stuff in there about that statistical inquiry cycle. I couldn't think of what that phrase was called earlier. So there's loads of support there. Have a look at the upcoming events widget that's on the right hand side, and scroll down, because that does, and the maths team are really good about saying, oh, there will be this support for stats or this support for maths, or just to see what else is coming, because there's always stuff coming. And then if you want to contact either Nick or Vicky within the Pearson Maths team, you can do. There's their details. Check out the podcast. There's loads of great people on there. If you're into your podcasts, there's a PD Academy where this video will go, and loads of other resources. Again, go and have a look. And then you will get a thing about your feedback, and I have to apologise, I've got a stinking cold. So it does matter, because it helps us form if you feel there was too much of this. But it is quite difficult to give you a feel for it, because I try to put myself in your situation, saying, well, okay, what topics do I need to teach? It's all well and good, you've got more entries, brilliant, look, whoopee-doo, but what do I need to teach, and how can I get better at it? What I would say is the work solutions are amazing for checking what was acceptable. It will never replace the mark scheme, because the mark scheme, but even the mark scheme isn't full of all the different acceptable solutions or acceptable answers. And I always say that if you got one golden nugget, even if it was showing your student those graphs, it was worth giving up an hour of your time.